So right-wing Republican Governor Greg Abbott threatens to arrest Texas Democratic state legislators who stand in the way of him passing voting restrictions. If you're not concerned about authoritarianism in America, well, you're not paying attention. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, and maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So if you notice that today I seem a little bit more casual, it's because I'm on vacation actually this week. Nevertheless, the news never stops, and certainly with what's going on in Texas, we had to have a video today. Democratic state legislators in Texas literally fled the state to try to stop Republicans from passing new restrictions on voting access. Now remember, Texas is one of the states that already is the hardest state in the union to vote in. And these new voting restrictions, even though they're not quite as onerous as the ones that the Democrats stopped in the last session, are still horrendous, stopping things that people took advantage of in the last election, things like 24-hour voting and access to absentee ballots and that type of thing, just basically trying to make it harder for people to vote. Now, the Texas legislature is kind of odd, and it's really a part-time legislature. It only meets once every 2 years, and it's limited to 140 days of meetings. That's how in the last session, the Texas Democrats were able to basically walk out of the session on the last day of session and stop the Republicans from passing the last version of this legislation. In theory, that was the last opportunity for Texas Republicans to pass this legislation until after the next election. Now, the maneuver that Democrats use is something that both parties have used, frankly, and what it has to do is with denying the other party what's called a quorum. A quorum is where the law mandates that you have to have a certain number of people present to be able to conduct business. In Texas, the legislature requires 2/3 of the representatives to be present. By leaving the session, the Texas Democrats basically denied the Republicans access to that quorum. And so as a result, the legislature was not able to pass the legislation. Now, after this last regular session expired without passing the legislation, Governor Greg Abbott called a special session of the legislature. Now, this is worthy of note because he didn't bother to call a special session of the legislature when the state was dealing with massive blackouts and huge power bills. He didn't bother to call a special session of the state legislature when they were dealing with hurricanes and flooding. But God forbid some people of color try to vote. That's worth a special legislative session, according to Governor Greg Abbott. Well, after this onerous and burdensome voting legislation passed the Senate, over 50 House Democrats fled the state to stop the legislature from passing this legislation. Now, it's worthy of note that this is a courageous act on their part that required substantial personal sacrifice on the part of many of them. I mean, after all, they need to leave the state at their own expense, many of them leaving behind their families and their jobs. They only earn $7,200 a year as legislators, and the governor has basically vetoed the funding of the legislature already, so they're not even getting that. In fact, I love how the Texas governor claims that this is a junket at taxpayer expense when the taxpayers aren't footing the bill for this at all. This is something being done at personal sacrifice on the part of the legislators, showing their deep commitment to voting rights, something that the Republicans are intent on attacking no matter what. Upon learning that the Democrats fled the state to deny him this effort to try to stop people of color from voting, Governor Greg Abbott literally threw a temper tantrum, insisting that he was going to arrest these legislators if they came back into the state.
I can and I will continue to call special session after special session after special session all the way up until election next year. And so if these people want to be hanging out wherever they're hanging out on this taxpayer-paid junket, they're going to have to be prepared to do it for well over a year. As soon as they come back in the state of Texas, they will be arrested.
There you have it. It really says something, I think, that Republicans are so committed to stopping people from voting that they're willing to go to these lengths. Now, you don't need to worry about these Texas Democrats actually going to prison, by the way. They haven't violated any laws. What the law does do, though, is it empowers the Speaker of the House to be able to detain members of the legislature to force them into session. This is something akin to the power that the law gives judges to enforce contempt of court sanctions against people who are unwilling to cooperate with orders of the court. But by fleeing the state, the Texas Democrats are basically beyond the jurisdiction of the Texas law enforcement officials. So there's really nothing they can do about it as long as they stay out of the state, which again points to the substantial personal sacrifice these legislators are making on behalf of all of us. Now, the Democrats, for their part, didn't just flee the state. They actually went to Washington to lobby Congress to pass the John Lewis voting rights legislation and the For the People Act. These are two pieces of legislation that would basically reverse the efforts of the Republicans and the different state legislators to restrict voting access. This legislation is supported by all the Democrats in the Senate and has already passed the House. The only thing that's blocking passage right now is the filibuster in the Senate. So Democrats need to do one of two things. They need to either bring in some additional exception to the filibuster rule that will allow them to pass this voting rights legislation, or they need to pass voting rights legislation as part of the broader reconciliation package. Now, you should know there are already all kinds of exceptions to the filibuster rule. For example, Republicans made it that you can approve Supreme Court justice nominations without the filibuster getting in the way. So any claim that this is something new on the part of the Democrats is simply bad faith. And reconciliation is a process that allows you to make changes that affect the budget without having to worry about the filibuster. It's the same process, by the way, that Democrats were able to pass the COVID relief bill without a single Republican vote, and the Republicans were able to pass the Trump tax giveaway to the rich. So Democrats have options here. It's just a matter of the so-called moderates, like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, being willing to step up and do something to allow this voting rights legislation to move forward. Now is an especially good time, by the way, to be talking about reconciliation, because Chuck Schumer just announced yesterday that the Democratic members of the Budget Committee had come up with a plan that would form the basis for a reconciliation package, and that this plan would include many of the things that Joe Biden has been pushing for. They include things like taxes on the wealthy, an expansion of the infrastructure funding to deal with climate change, expansion of education, and making permanent some of the benefits that have helped people with their health care and child care expenses. Vice President Kamala Harris has been working with this Texas delegation to try to push this legislation forward. In fact, she's meeting with them this week. My hope is that these Democratic senators will see the sacrifices that are being made by these Texas legislators and will stand up with the same courage that they have shown. Now, as Democratic activists, it's probably also incumbent on us to call and insist that our senators and legislators move forward with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act. The example that these courageous Democratic legislators from Texas are showing should be an example to all of us, and I hope that the Democratic senators take that example. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to hear your comments down below. As always, I'll post links to articles on this subject matter down below as well. If you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, that'd be a huge help, and I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.